Good evening, and welcome to the Sleepy History. I'm glad you're here. Whatever kind of day it's been, you can set it down now. There's nothing to keep up with tonight, nothing to remember, nowhere else to be. If these stories help you rest, liking the video or subscribing quietly helps us keep making them, and helps the next tired listener find their way here too. Let yourself settle in. Before we speak of sitters, let us speak of a door. It is the end of an ordinary day in a place that no longer exists, a place whose name, if it had one, has been worn smooth by the passing centuries. We don't need that name tonight. We need only the door. It is made of wood, dark with age and the oil of many hands, and it sits a little crooked in its frame, the way old doors eventually do. And it still opens. That is the important thing. Tonight someone is still home. Listen if you can to the small sounds of the arriving evening. The light outside has turned the colour of honey, then of embers, and now it is sliding toward blue. Inside, in the cooling dim of a single room, a hand reaches for a lamp. We won't see the face. We rarely do in these stories. But we can watch the hand, ordinary and tired and sure of itself, as it tips a little oil into a shallow clay dish, settles the wick, and coaxes up a flame. The flame steadies, and the walls turn from grey to gold. The plaster has been cracked and patched again, and now it glows as though it were something fine. It is only a wall, but tonight it holds back the dark, and that is enough. Somewhere in this room, there is the smell of the evening meal, something plain, grain and oil and whatever the season allowed. A small fire has done its work and is sinking into coals. A sleeping mat is rolled in one corner. There is a jar of water carried home that morning and not yet empty, and a threshold worn into a shallow curve by the passing of feet we will never count. These are not the things history usually keeps. History tends to remember the rulers in their palaces, the councils and the temples, the public halls where important men made their decisions. It rarely pauses at a crooked door to watch a lamp being lit. But we will, because so much of what mattered happened here, in the small circle of one light, where someone is about to eat and rest, and assume without a moment's doubt that tomorrow will look much like today. They don't know what we know. They aren't thinking of endings. They are thinking perhaps of the meal or of sleep or of nothing much at all. And there is a kindness in letting them stay that way just for now. So we won't hurry them. We'll stand in the warmth of this room longer and let the lamp burn and the evening settle. For beyond that door lie thousands of other doors, in thousands of other rooms, and the city they belong to is only beginning to wake into our story. Step back out through that doorway now, into the street, and notice the first thing that meets you. It isn't a sight, it's a sound. A living city is never truly silent, not even at this late hour. It hums, and before we can understand how a city goes quiet, we have to learn what its fullness sounded like. The way you might memorize a piece of music before you'd recognize a single missing note. So let us stand here in the cooling evening air and listen, the way the people who lived here listened without ever thinking about it. Underneath everything there are footsteps, sandals and bare feet on packed earth and worn stone, some hurrying, some unhurried, crossing and overlapping until they blur into a single steady rhythm, like rain that never quite stops. You stop hearing it after a while, if you live here. It becomes the floor beneath all the other sounds, the proof, never spoken aloud, that you are not alone. Above the footsteps there are voices, not words you could follow, just the warm murmur of many conversations at once, drifting from open windows and doorways and the mouths of narrow lanes. Someone calls a child in for the night. Someone laughs 2 streets over at a joke you'll never hear. Somewhere a baby frets and is comforted. These voices don't carry meaning to us across all this distance, but they carry something better. They carry presence. People are here, talking to one another as people do about everything and nothing. Then there is the water. Listen for it, and in some quarters you might begin to notice it. The creak of a bucket rope, the slosh of a full jar settled against a hip, the thin trickle of a public fountain steady enough to become part of the neighbourhood's nightly rhythm. Water is the pulse of a place like this. carried and poured and shared, and we will come back to it before long, because its story turns out to be the city's own. Closer in, there are the smaller sounds, the domestic ones. A shutter drawn closed against the dark, a pot scraped clean, the dry rustle of someone sweeping a doorstep one last time before bed. And out at the edges, the animals, a dog answering another dog across the rooftops, a donkey shifting in its stall, the soft complaint of penned goats settling for the night. None of it is loud. All of it together is the sound of a place that is thoroughly, ordinarily alive. We are gathering these sounds tonight on purpose. We are picking them up carefully, the way you might collect smooth stones along a path and slip them into a pocket, not because any single one is remarkable, but because you want to remember the place you found them. Keep them with you. The footsteps, the murmur of voices, the water moving from hand to hand, the shutters and the sleepy animals. Because this story is, in the end, the story of these sounds growing fewer, not all at once and not tonight. Tonight the city is full, and the noise of living rises into the dark and feels as though it could go on without end. But every one of these sounds came from somewhere. Each had a source, a reason, a person behind it. And the first source we'll follow, the one so much of the city was quietly built around, is the water. Before we follow the water, there is one more thing to settle between us gently, so that nothing in the hours ahead will alarm you. When we imagine an ancient city coming to its end, we tend to reach for dramatic pictures. Fire, an army at the gates, a single terrible night, a sky full of smoke, and then nothing. It makes for a vivid story, and now and then something like it did happen. Some cities did meet sudden ends through warfare or disaster, and we won't pretend otherwise. But many ancient cities reached their quieter years in far less dramatic ways. The truer word for them is not fall, it is quiet. Many cities did not end in a single moment. They thinned, changed, or contracted across years and generations, so gradually that the people living through it would have struggled to name the year it began, because there was no year. There was only a long, uneven drift, measured not in battles but in ordinary days, most of which felt entirely unremarkable to the people having them. A family moved away and another stayed. A workshop closed, and the one beside it kept its fire lit a while longer. Nothing announced itself. That is a harder kind of change to see, which is exactly why it interests us. A burning city tells its own story in a night. A quieting city keeps its story for generations, hiding the whole vast shift inside the smallest details. One fewer lamp in a window this winter than last. A street that takes a little longer to fill in the morning. A familiar voice you realize one day you haven't heard in some time, without ever quite deciding when it stopped. So we are going to set the dramatic pictures aside, not because such things never happened, but because they are not the story we're telling tonight. We won't be listening for the crash that ends everything. Instead, we'll be watching for something more human. We'll be watching a place change and contract by degrees, without a single moment that clearly marked the end. The way a person does at the end of a long day, by degrees, without ceremony, almost without noticing. And there is a reassurance hidden in that, worth holding on to as you settle in. An ending that comes slowly as an ending with room in it. Room for ordinary life to keep happening right up until the last. The people in our story, in the kind of city whose street we're imagining tonight, will go on lighting their lamps and carrying their water and calling their children indoors, year after year, long after the streets have begun to thin around them. They may not understand themselves as living through the ending of a city. They're continuing with the immediate work of ordinary life. And that is the version of the past we'll be keeping company with here. These slow changes rarely followed one pattern, and the evidence they left behind tends to unfold unevenly, across years and generations. We'll follow that change one reason at a time, beginning with the water that helped make urban life possible. So let us begin with that water, and return now to the first grey light of morning. Let the evening we've been sitting in fade, and let the day come back to the street, because there is a place we should visit while the light is still soft, before the heat arrives. In many ancient cities, there was a place like this. A well, a fountain, a spring, or another shared source of water. In other places, people drew from cisterns, from channels and stored vessels, from a nearby river, or from water carried in along greater works. But where a shared source stood at the edge of a square, it could become one of the most important centres of ordinary neighbourhood life. The day began here for a great many households. The jars came out balanced on hips and shoulders, and the heads of those who had learned from childhood how to balance the familiar weight. The rope went down, the bucket came up, and the water passed from the shared source into private homes, one vessel at a time. In many places, this work fell to women and girls, to servants and enslaved people, or to labourers, though who came and when would have varied from one street, one household, and one season to the next. But to call it only work would miss what else was happening at the water's edge. This was where the neighbourhood met itself each morning. We can imagine some of what may have passed between them while the jars filled. Who was ill, whose daughter was to be married and to whom, whose roof had failed in the last rain. A recipe, a remedy, a quiet word to someone who needed one. Such things would have travelled here alongside the water, and some lingered for a moment after the jars were filled. Picture it. The wet stone rim, dark and smooth where countless hands and ropes had worn it. The clay jars waiting in a row. The early light catching the surface of the water far below. A small bright coin at the bottom of the dark. Voices, unhurried in the cool of the morning. We tend to remember ancient cities by their monuments, the things built to be remembered. But monuments shaped how a city displayed itself, while water shaped whether ordinary daily life could continue at all. The whole structure of the city, its homes and its work and its families, rested in part on this daily gathering, repeated so faithfully and for so long that no one thought to record it. It was simply what one did. It was the morning. And because so much depended on it, water mattered profoundly to the continuation of daily life here. It shaped where people lived and how their days were arranged. So before we go any further, it is worth asking a simple question, the kind no one at the well would have paused to ask, because the answer was all around them. Where did all this water come from, and who, unseen, had brought it here? The answer, in many cities, lay out of sight. It ran beneath the paving stones, or threaded down from the hills beyond the walls, or sat waiting in the dark beneath the houses themselves. The water that arrived so easily at the well had usually travelled a long and carefully managed road to get there, and many who drew from it each morning may rarely have needed to think about the full route it had travelled. That was rather the point. When such systems worked reliably, much of their complexity could remain out of ordinary view. The forms they took varied a great deal from place to place. In some cities, channels carried water down from distant springs, following the gentlest possible slope across miles of country, losing only a little height with every stride, so that the water would keep moving without ever rushing. In others, lines of clay or stone pipe ran beneath the streets, branching and narrowing as they went. In many homes and courtyards there were cisterns, quiet underground rooms that caught the rains of winter and held them, dark and cool, against the long dry months ahead. Often a single city used several of these methods at once, layered over generations, each addition built atop the work of people long gone. None of it ran by itself. This is the part that is easy to miss, and it matters for everything that follows. A water system was not a thing you built once and then enjoyed forever. It was a thing you kept. Channels silted up and had to be cleared. Pipes cracked and had to be found and mended. Cisterns needed sealing, basins needed cleaning, and the whole long thread of it needed walking, season after season, by people who knew where the weak points were and how to read the small signs of trouble before they became large ones. So beneath the comfortable ease of the morning well, there was labour, much of it hidden in every sense. Picture the inside of one of those channels, barely wide enough for a person to crouch and work. The cool, damp air, the drip and trickle close to the ear, a lamp set on a ledge, its small flame leaning in the moving air, throwing light on walls crusted pale with the minerals the water left behind, year upon year, like rings inside a tree. And in that light a worker, clearing what had settled, patching what had failed, doing again the work that had been done 100 times before and would need doing 100 times again. We rarely know their names. The people who carried the water are mostly absent from the records, and the people who kept it flowing are absent even from that absence. Yet the whole bright surface of the city, the full markets and the busy streets and the unworried morning at the well, rested on this patient invisible upkeep, performed by hands we cannot picture and would not recognize. Which raises a quiet question, one the city itself would eventually have to answer. A system that depends on constant care will last only as long as the care does. So what happens slowly when the hands grow fewer and the knowledge begins to thin? In the kind of gradual decline we're following tonight, the water often did not disappear all at once. It withdrew the way the tide goes out, so gradually that you could stand and watch and never quite see it move. A channel might begin to silt somewhere out in the hills where no one walked often, and the flow that reached the city would slacken by a degree no single person would notice. A spring might weaken across a run of dry years, giving a little less each season than the one before. A buried pipe might crack and simply stay cracked, because the person who once knew how to find such things had moved away, or grown old, or was needed elsewhere. Taken separately, none necessarily marked the end of the city. Each was a small subtraction, and the city absorbed it the way a household absorbs a rise in the price of grain, by adjusting quietly and carrying on, and people did adjust. This is where the change actually lived, not in any dramatic moment, but in the ordinary work of getting by. A family that had drawn water from the near fountain began walking to one a little farther off, because the near one now ran thin by mid-morning. A jar that had always been filled to the brim was filled instead to the shoulder and made to last. The washing was done a little less often. The small daily generosities with water, the rinsing and the watering and the topping up, grew quietly more careful. For a long while, none of this felt like decline. It felt like the way things were now, which is how most large changes feel to the people inside them. A child growing up in these years would not have known the fuller days their grandparents remembered. To that child, the longer walk to water was simply the walk to water. The thinner flow was simply the flow. But the adjustments did add up. Each one was small enough to forgive, small enough to manage, and that was precisely how they accumulated, without anyone fully knowing what they would eventually mean, the way a person can carry one more parcel, and one more, and one more, until quite suddenly the load is more than the arms can hold. There was no single morning when the water became too hard to reach. There was only a slow gathering of mornings, each a little harder than the last, and as the water grew harder to reach, it began, very gently, to change the most basic question of all, the one that sits underneath where every household lives. If the well that defined this corner of the city was failing, then the corner itself was no longer quite the place it had been, and a few families here and there began to wonder whether home might be somewhere a little nearer the water. In the gradual kind of departure we're following tonight, it often did not begin with a crowd. Some of the earlier households to leave may have gone one at a time, so quietly that the street itself barely registered their absence. There was no announcement, no procession, no moment anyone would later be able to point to and say that was when it started. There was only, here and there, a door that stopped opening. We can imagine how such a leaving might have gone, even if the records rarely preserve it. A household weighs its small reasons, most of them practical rather than dramatic. The water nearby has grown unreliable. A relative in a village 2 days off has offered a room, or a field, or simply a roof. The eldest has gone already, and sent word that things are steadier where the spring still runs. It may have involved grief, uncertainty, practicality, or some mixture of them, the difficult arithmetic of deciding where life might remain possible. And so, the cart is loaded. Perhaps in the cool of early morning, the jars wrapped in cloth, the tools, The mat, the cooking pot, a few small objects used in family life or private devotion, carried carefully because some things you do not leave behind. The door is pulled shut. Perhaps the key is turned in the lock out of habit, a gesture towards a return that those leaving and those watching may already doubt. A neighbour lifts a hand, a few words are exchanged, the kind people say when they don't quite know what to say, and then the cart moves off, and the street has one fewer family in it than it did the day before. What makes these departures understandable, without making them painless, is how ordinary they felt at the time. No one leaving thought of themselves as part of the end of a city. They thought of themselves as a family making a sensible move toward better water, better work, a better chance. The grand story we can see from a distance was up close, just a household doing what households have always done, which is to go where life is a little more possible. Leaving a home is rarely without its ache, but an ache can be carried alongside a sensible decision. The street absorbed it, as streets do. The empty house stood there, shutters closed, and for a while the neighbours still spoke of it as the home of the people who had gone, rather than as an empty house at all. Life on the corner continued. The well, weakened though it was, still drew its smaller morning gathering, but those who stayed had reasons to stay, and among the strongest was the need to remain near work, customers, tools, relatives, and familiar forms of support. Much of that work happened in homes, workshops, streets, and harbours, but one place brought many of these lives visibly together. To understand why people still remained, we must follow the morning crowds toward the market. So follow them, out of the side streets and the narrow lanes, into the widening flow of people all moving the same way, toward the open ground where the market gathered. You could find it without looking. You followed the sound, the rising braid of voices and footsteps and bargaining, and you followed the smell, bread somewhere and fish somewhere else, and the warm dust of many people in one place. Long before you arrived, the market told you it was there. In a city like the one we are imagining, this was where the morning came most fully alive. Whatever form it took, an open square, a colonnaded street, or a stretch of ground near a harbour, it often became one of the places where goods, news, and familiar faces came together. It was where the things people needed changed hands, and where in the changing a great deal more passed between them than goods. Picture the stalls as they might have stood, knowing that the exact wares and the ways of paying for them varied from place to place and age to age. Baskets of grain, a staple for many households, measured out and poured. Jars of oil sealed and waiting. Whatever the season had given, set out in heaps and bundles. Vegetables still cool from the early hour. Fruit, herbs tied with twine. In some markets there were textiles, cloth dyed in the colours a household could afford, folded and stacked and turned to the light so the colour showed. There were everyday wares, pots and lamps and the small iron and bronze things that a home wears out and must replace. And moving among it all, the small coins, or sometimes no coins at all, but an exchange of one needed thing for another. It would be a mistake to picture only commerce, though. A market was where a city met itself in daylight, the way the well gathered the neighbourhood at dawn but on a larger and noisier scale. Here a person saw faces from across the city, not just their own corner of it. Acquaintances stopped. News travelled as it always did wherever people paused together. A buyer and a seller who had known each other for years went through the familiar dance of price, not entirely because of the price, but because the back and forth was part of the day, part of being known. This was another way the city revealed its life, not only through monuments, but through the ordinary abundance of a working morning, in the sheer number of people who had somewhere to be and something to trade and the expectation that tomorrow would bring the same. A full market could be one of the most reassuring sights a city offered. It suggested that at least some roads and supply lines were still working, that food and goods were still arriving, and that the systems supporting the city were for now holding. And that last point is worth holding on to as the light climbs and the square fills, because not one of these stalls was self-sufficient. The grain, the oil, the cloth, the metal, Much of it had come from somewhere else, often somewhere far away, carried in along roads and sea lanes the people in the market would never see. The abundance in front of us had a long road behind it, and it is that road we should follow next. Step back from the stall then, and let your mind travel outward, past the edge of the market, past the last houses, past the city wall, out to where the roads begin. Many cities, especially larger ones, depended partly on places beyond their own walls. A city might wear cloth woven elsewhere, use metal mined beyond its region, and supplement local food with goods brought from farther away. All of it carried patiently across distances that would have taken its people many days or many weeks to walk. This is the part the morning market quietly concealed. The abundance looked local. It looked as though the city simply produced what it needed, the way a garden produces vegetables. And some of it truly was local, grown and made within sight of the walls. But much of what filled those baskets had begun its journey far away, in fields and groves and workshops and mines scattered across the wider world, and had reached the market only through a long chain of hands. The shapes of those journeys varied a great deal from one city, region and age to the next. In some places, goods moved overland, loaded onto the backs of animals or into carts, following roads and tracks that crossed hills and plains and river crossings, passing from one trading hand to the next. Where geography allowed, ships and rivercraft could move heavy goods more efficiently than long overland journeys, carrying grain and oil and other weighty things along coastlines, between harbours and up the great rivers. Many cities drew on several of these at once, a web of routes by land and water reaching out in every direction. It helps to picture it not as a single supply line, but as a web, fine and far-reaching and mostly invisible to the people who depended on it. A jar of oil on a market stall was the visible end of a long, unseen thread, a thread that ran back through the trader who brought it, the harbour where it was unloaded, the ship that carried it, the press where it was made, and the grove where the trees had grown for longer than anyone could remember. The city stood at the gathering point of countless such threads, drawing them in, and that arrangement, for all its reach, depended on things staying reasonably steady far beyond the city's own walls. Roads needed to remain passable and reasonably safe. Harbours needed to keep working. The distant places that grew the grain and pressed the oil needed to keep growing and pressing it. None of this was guaranteed, and much of it lay beyond the direct control of any single household, merchant, or city authority. It rested on a wider order whose full reach was difficult to see, and which many people may have noticed most clearly only when something failed, which is exactly why the first sign of trouble, when it came, would not arrive as news of a distant road gone quiet or a far harbour fallen still. It would arrive as something much smaller and much closer to home. It would arrive as an empty space where a familiar stall used to be. It might have begun with a single trader who simply did not come back. One season he was there, in his usual place, with the goods he always brought from wherever it was he came from. The next season, his corner of the market stood empty. At first, no one read much into it. A trader might miss a season for many reasons, perhaps illness, a difficult journey, or business that kept them elsewhere. People assumed he would return, and for a while they kept the space for him in their minds, the way the street had kept the memory of the families who left. But he did not return, and in time others did not either. This is how a far-off disruption would have made itself felt, not as a story about distant roads, but as a slow series of small absences close to hand. A particular kind of cloth grew harder to find, and then could not be found at all. A spice that had always been there became a thing people remembered rather than bought. A price climbed, and instead of easing again, it remained high or rose further. None of these changes announced what lay behind them. Each simply appeared one morning as the new shape of the market, and many people tried to adapt as best they could. If the better cloth was gone, you bought the plainer kind, or you mended what you had a little longer. If a familiar good had vanished, you found something near enough to take its place, or you learned to do without and stopped thinking of it. Some households, of course, could manage these adjustments more easily than others. But there was a quiet skill in it, the same skill the households had shown with the water, the ability to absorb a loss gradually, even when the adjustment brought inconvenience or hardship. Life simply rearranged itself around the gap. What gave the change its particular feel was memory, and the way earlier days can grow fuller through the softening distance of time. We can imagine the older traders and the older customers speaking of how the market used to be, how you could find anything once, how crowded the square had been. The young, who had never seen those days, might have listened politely and not quite believed it, because the market they knew, thinner though it was simply the market. But the gaps did add up, the way the longer walks to water had added up. One empty stall was nothing. A handful of empty stalls was a quieter morning, and slowly, season by season, the balance shifted, until a person walking through could not help but notice that the spaces between the sellers had grown wider than they used to be, and that the great braided noise of the place had thinned to something you could almost hear the edges of. A thinner market meant fewer buyers, and fewer buyers meant something for the people whose whole living depended on the work the market once brought them. Follow the thinning market back to the people who supplied it, and you come to the workshops. For many workshops, a thinning market could mean fewer customers, fewer commissions, and less reason to keep production at its former pace. Some craftspeople also worked through household production, private commissions, local exchange, or wider trade. But where the market mattered to a workshop, its quieting reached the people there through their hands in the simplest way imaginable. Fewer came and fewer bought, and so there was less to make. Consider the kinds of work a city like this held. The potter at the wheel, turning out the jars, cups and lamps used across many households, steadily worn through and steadily replaced. The weaver at the loom, the cloth growing row by patient row. The smith at the forge, mending tools and making the small metal things that kept her home running. These were not usually the kinds of trades celebrated in grand monuments, but they were essential to daily urban life, learned over years, sometimes within families and sometimes through workshops, masters, or other working relationships. And when the orders thinned, the workshops felt it first as a slackening of rhythm. A potter who had once kept the kiln busy now fired it less often, because there were not enough orders to fill it. A weaver finished a length of cloth and did not immediately begin another, because the buyer who would have taken it had grown scarce. The forge that had rung from morning to dusk fell silent for stretches of the day. The work did not vanish all at once, it simply came less often and brought in less when it came. There is a particular quietness to a workshop with its fire gone cold, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is different from the emptiness of an abandoned house. The tools are still there, hung in their places, ready. The skill may still remain in the hands of the person who learned it over many years. The potter may still know how to throw a perfect cup. The skill may remain even as customers, materials, income, and opportunities grow fewer. This is one of the quieter sorrows of a fading city. A weaver does not stop being a weaver because the loom stands idle, and there is real dignity in that skill, in the knowledge that outlasts the work itself. But a trade is also a living thing, kept alive by use, and when the use thins, something in the daily life of the city thins with it. A hum of productive work that had been there so long no one noticed it until it began to fade. For the household, it could also mean harder choices, as the income and security that work once brought grew less certain. And when work grows scarce, a household leans more heavily on what it can do for itself, on the labour, the stored food, the mending and managing and mutual help that go on indoors no matter what the market does. It turns toward home. So step back across the threshold, out of the thinning street and the quieting workshop, and into the house itself. This is where we began, you may remember, with a single lamp being lit at evening. Now we come back in daylight to look more closely at the rooms, because in a fading city the home became more important than ever. As the work outside grew scarce, the work inside did not. If anything, more of life folded back into these walls. Homes in the ancient world took many shapes, depending on place and period and how much a family had. Some were a single room, some opened around a courtyard, some were shared, floor above floor, or wall against wall. But across that great variety, certain things tended to recur, because certain needs were shared by nearly everyone. There was somewhere to cook, there was somewhere to sleep, there was somewhere to keep what little the household stored against tomorrow, and often somewhere set aside, however modestly, for whatever the family held sacred. In many homes, cooking fire and food preparation formed one practical centre of daily life. Whether at a fixed place for fire, a portable brazier, an oven, a courtyard, or facilities shared with others, here the day's grain might become the day's meal, tended by hands that knew the work so well they barely needed to watch it. In many ancient societies, much of the food preparation and household management fell to women, often alongside daughters, servants, enslaved people, and other family members. But the arrangements varied by place, by class, by period, by culture, and by the particular shape of each family, and we should be careful not to flatten all those lives into one. What we can say is that the home was for many not a place of rest so much as a place of work, quiet, constant, and largely unrecorded. Food had to be obtained and prepared, grain might be ground, bread baked or purchased, and stored supplies carefully managed. Water, carried in that morning, had to be made to last through the day. Cloth had to be made or mended, the fire kept, the children watched, the sick tended, the small endless maintenance of living attended to again and again. Picture the room around it all. The smoke-darkened wall above the cooking fire, the sleeping mats rolled and set aside until night, the storage jars in their corner, a few simple objects of family or devotional meaning on a shelf or in a niche. It is easy, looking back, to overlook all this. Much surviving written evidence favours public, legal, commercial, and elite concerns, while domestic labour often appears indirectly or unevenly, and women, servants, enslaved people, and children are frequently less visible in it. And so this work can seem falsely to have mattered less. But a city depended not only on its markets and public institutions, but also on the daily functioning of its households. Whatever happened in the market or the council hall, much of everyday survival was organised within and around the household, meal by meal and day by day. And as the wider city thinned, this domestic work could grow heavier and more important than before. For some households, it may have weighed more as supplies, income, and neighbourhood support became less dependable. With less coming in from outside, more had to be stretched, saved, and made to last within. The truth of how a family was faring could often be read most honestly not in the street, but in one particular place, where the household kept its food. Come, then, to the place where the food was kept. In many homes, it was not a grand space, perhaps only a cool corner, a row of jars against an inner wall, a niche away from the heat and the light. But it was, in its undramatic way, one of the most important spaces in the house, because it held the answer to the question every household lives with, whether it says so or not. Do we have enough to reach tomorrow, and the day after, and the season after that? Picture what such a corner might hold. Large jars for grain, the staple that many households leaned on most heavily, their level dropping as the weeks wore on. Smaller vessels for oil sealed against the air. Depending on place, season, and means, some foods might be dried, salted, fermented, or stored in oil, put up in the good times to be drawn on in the lean ones. Bundles of herbs, perhaps, hanging where the air could reach them. This was a household's quiet insurance against an uncertain world, built up when it could be and spent down carefully when it had to be. And in a fading city where the supply from outside had grown less dependable, the management of this small store could become an art in itself. Women often played a major part in it, alongside daughters, servants, enslaved people, older relatives, and others who shared the work of the home. It was an art of arithmetic and judgment, performed without ever being called either. How much food remained, how long it needed to last, and when wages, market supplies, household production, or another dependable source might next arrive, when to draw the stores down and when to hold them back, how to stretch a quantity that would once have been spent freely so that it reached further than it was ever meant to. The skill showed itself in small adjustments, each almost invisible on its own. A loaf might be made a little smaller so that the grain would last a few more days. A soup might be stretched with more water and a little less of everything else, seasoned carefully to make a limited meal as satisfying as circumstances allowed. A small reserve of grain, oil, or dried food might be set firmly aside and not touched, no matter how tight things grew, kept back against an even harder week. Such adjustments could show skill and foresight, even when they were also evidence of genuine pressure. There is real dignity in this, and it is worth naming plainly, because it is so easily passed over. The histories that come down to us seldom record who decided that the loaf would be smaller this week, or how a household made a thinning store last through a hard winter. Much of that knowledge was transmitted through practice rather than writing, leaving only uneven traces for us. Yet it was exactly this quiet competence that helped keep families fed through the lean stretches, long after the market had grown unreliable. Still, a household did not manage all of this entirely alone. For all the skill kept within these walls, families had always leaned on the people just beyond them, the neighbours who lent and borrowed and watched and helped. And as the city thinned, that web of nearby support began, here and there, to thin as well. Few households could rely entirely on themselves. However skilled a family was at managing what it had, it usually lived inside a wider web of help, drawing on relatives, neighbours, workers, and the people closest by. This was the part of survival that happened not within the walls, but just outside them, in the space between one door and the next, and in a thinning city it was among the quietest things to fade. Think of what neighbours could mean in a place like this. In many crowded ancient settlements, homes stood close together, sometimes sharing a courtyard, a wall, a stair, a stretch of street. Where trust, custom, and circumstance allowed, this nearness could create a steady traffic of assistance. A handful of something borrowed when the store ran low, and returned, or repaid in kind, when it could be. A tool passed from one household to another, since no family needed to own everything if the lane between them was friendly. An eye kept on a child playing in the courtyard while a mother's hands were full, a look in on someone ill, old, or newly bereaved. Much of it may never have been formally recorded, though some duties, loans, agreements, and disputes did enter written records. Mostly it was simply how people who lived close together made life workable. This would have varied, of course, by place and custom and the particular temper of a given street. Not every neighbour was kind, and not every household was on easy terms with the ones beside it. But across many closely settled communities, some degree of mutual dependence was difficult to avoid. To live among others was to be, in countless small ways, held by them, and this was exactly the thing that the slow emptying of a city wore away. When a family left, what went with them was not only their door closing for good, it was a particular set of hands no longer there to lend, a particular face no longer at the well or in the courtyard, a particular thread pulled out of the web. One departure might be absorbed more easily than many. The remaining neighbours simply leaned a little more on one another. But as the departures accumulated, season upon season, the web grew thinner, until a household might look around and find that most of the people it had once relied on were gone. There is a particular loneliness in that, different from the loneliness of being truly alone. It is the loneliness of remaining, of being the one still there in a place that is emptying around you. Picture a courtyard that once held the overlapping voices of several families, where now a single child plays in the quiet, and the doorways that face inward are mostly shut. The households long departed. The space is the same, the walls are the same, only the life between them has thinned. For those who stayed, this made the bonds that endured all the more precious, the few remaining neighbours, the family within the home, the ties that held when so much else had loosened. And for some households, familiar prayers, offerings, and domestic rituals provided one source of steadiness when other forms of support became less dependable. In some ancient homes, a corner, a niche, a shelf, or a small group of objects could be associated with household devotion. Religious activity might also gather around a cooking fire, a courtyard, a doorway, a family tomb, a shared sanctuary, or a public sacred place, depending on culture, period, status, and household. The forms it took varied enormously across the ancient world, from one tradition and faith and age to the next, and we should hold that variety in mind rather than picture a single kind of shrine. But behind many of these practices lay a widely shared impulse, the wish to keep what one held sacred close to home, woven into the fabric of daily life. Where such household practices existed, they could form an intimate and recurring part of family life. Public sanctuaries and civic ceremonies formed one part of religious life, while household observances could form another, more intimate part. In some homes, this might mean a few words spoken, a small offering left, a lamp tended, or a gesture made in passing, though the particular customs varied widely from one household and tradition to the next. Much of it may have been so habitual, so woven into the day that those performing it might scarcely have thought of it as remarkable. It was simply part of how one lived. We should be careful not to assume too much about what any of it meant to the people who did it. Belief is a private thing, unevenly recorded and easily misread across such a distance of time, and the same gesture might have carried deep feeling for one person, family duty for another, and simple habit for a third. But it is reasonable to think that, for at least some households, these familiar observances offered something steadying, a sense of continuity and care in a world where much lay beyond anyone's control, and in a fading city that steadiness may have mattered all the more for some. As the neighbours thinned and the market grew uncertain and the familiar shape of life loosened at its edges, some familiar observances could remain within reach of the household, though their form might become simpler or change as supplies, people, and beliefs changed. In keeping them up, however modestly, a household could hold on to a thread of the ordinary, a way of saying through action rather than words that life here went on. Picture one such corner at evening then, much as we began this whole journey, a small lamp lit before whatever a family held dear, the soft light pooling in the niche, a hand pausing there for a moment at the close of the day before turning to sleep. It is a modest scene, easy to pass over, and it was never the only shape such devotion took. But it could carry for some a quiet dignity, the insistence of ordinary people on tending what mattered to them, even as the larger world grew less certain around them. Faith of this kind could steady a home from the inside, but it had a larger counterpart out in the city, in the public sanctuaries and festivals where larger portions of the community might gather to mark the turning of the year together, and those public places of gathering were facing a quiet of their own. To understand what a city lost as it quieted, it helps to remember it on one of its fuller days, the kind of day given over to a festival. Across many ancient cities and settlements, certain days were marked as different from the ordinary rhythm of work tied to the turning of the seasons, to the honouring of a god or gods, to the memory of something a community held in common. The particular occasions varied enormously from place to place and age to age, and we should not imagine one festival standing for them all. But the shape of such days, the gathering and the shared attention would have been familiar in many places. On a day like this, the ordinary rhythm of the city gave way to something larger. Some of the workshops that we watched fall quiet in harder times might, on a festival morning, stand idle for a happier reason, their owners out among the crowds, others kept working as usual, and some grew busier than ever, supplying food, decorations, ritual objects, or other services the day required. The market's usual business might pause, shift, or swell. People who passed each other unspeaking on ordinary days could find themselves drawn into overlapping ceremonies, processions, meals, performances, and gatherings. Picture what such a day might have offered to the senses, allowing that the details differed widely. Public spaces dressed for the occasion, perhaps with greenery or cloth or whatever a community used to mark a day as special. The smell of food prepared in greater quantity than usual, and of offerings or incense where those were part of the rite. Sound everywhere. Music of some kind, voices raised together, the particular noise of a great many people in one place for a shared purpose rather than their separate errands. For a while, parts of the city could experience themselves as belonging to one larger occasion. Not everyone took part in the same way, of course, and we should be careful here. A festival might include some and exclude others, by status, by gender, by citizenship, by wealth, by freedom, by religion or origin, by belonging or not belonging to a particular group. The experience of the day was not identical for the wealthy and the poor, the free and the enslaved, the long-time resident and the outsider. But even with all those differences, days like these did something that ordinary days could not. They let part of a community see itself gathered and feel, for a while, the simple reassurance of its own size and presence. That shared visibility is worth holding on to, because it was one form of civic life that could become harder to maintain as population, resources, and institutions changed. Large public observances depended on some combination of participants, organisers, funding, food, offerings, labour, specialists, and civic or religious support. People came for many reasons: devotion, obligation, opportunity, a free meal, or simple enjoyment, not merely because they had leisure to spare. All of it rested on arrangements that a slow decline could quietly wear away. And so, before some sanctuaries ceased functioning in their earlier form, their festivals and public rites might already have become smaller, shorter, less frequent, or simply different, as the hands and resources that once sustained them grew fewer. A sacred place, like a water system or a household, had to be kept. We tend to think of temples and sanctuaries as fixed things, built once in stone and standing more or less forever. But behind that appearance of permanence lay a great deal of ongoing work, and in many places that work depended on a steady supply of people, resources, and attention that a thinning city could not always provide. Consider what the upkeep of such a place might have involved, knowing that the particulars varied widely. Sacred places took many forms, not only roofed temples but open-air altars, groves, springs, caves, courtyards, and other settings, depending on tradition and region. There were often those whose role it was to perform the rites, whether priests, attendants, officials, or other figures. Offerings might include food, drink, incense, animals, money, or other goods, depending on the tradition, along with the means to supply them. Where a sanctuary included buildings, roofs, walls, fittings, paved areas, and storage spaces also weathered and needed repair. And there were the practical hands behind the scenes, those who cleaned and carried and prepared, without whom little could happen at all. Support for all this might flow from many directions: civic funds, rulers or officials, wealthy patrons, associations, land and rents and endowments, the gifts of ordinary worshippers, and sometimes pilgrims or visitors from beyond the city. And as a city thinned, some of those streams could narrow. Local gifts and civic support might shrink as population and wealth changed, though some sanctuaries retained other sources of income or support. Patrons who had once endowed a rite might leave, fall on harder times, or simply not be replaced. Civic resources that had funded public religion might be needed elsewhere. The effect, where it came gradually. A festival that had run for several days might be kept to fewer. A rite that had required many hands might be simplified so that fewer could perform it. A repair that would once have been made at once might be put off for a season, and then another, until the small damage became a settled feature of the place. Such changes did not always follow from decline alone. They could also reflect political decisions, religious transformation, institutional reorganization, or shifting priorities. And such choices could reflect practical attempts to continue with fewer resources, though their motives and circumstances varied. Picture a sanctuary in such a season, still standing, still in use, but tended now by fewer figures, little weathered at its edges, a lamp or fire, where tradition required one, perhaps tended less regularly than before. There is no drama in it, only a slow softening of what had been bright and busy. In some places, the sacred site continued in a reduced or altered form, still meaningful, but supported by fewer people or resources. And as some sanctuaries continued in smaller or altered forms, the wider public spaces around them, the squares, open grounds and courtyards where the life of the city had gathered, were growing quieter too. Let us move now from the sanctuary toward one of the city's open gathering places, a square, marketplace, forecourt, or other open space where public life became especially visible. Whatever name it went by, and whatever exact form it took, this could be one of the places where a city displayed its shared life most openly. And it is here, perhaps more than anywhere, that a thinning city revealed itself in its empty spaces. Think of what such a place had been when the city was full. It might have served many purposes at once, a place to trade, to hear news, to settle disputes, to conduct the business of the community, to simply stand and watch the day go by in company. Public life, of course, lived in many other places too, in streets and gateways, harbours and temples, theatres and workshops and the spaces of each neighbourhood. But the underlying thing these open grounds shared was people, coming and going through the daylight hours. At busy hours, the repeated movement of people gave the space much of its character. And such a place is one whose emptiness can show more plainly than a house's does. The absence inside a house might not be immediately visible from the street, while an open space could reveal a thinning crowd more plainly. Many formal public spaces gained much of their meaning from repeated gathering, movement, exchange, and public business. And when those thinned, the scale itself became a kind of statement. The same paving that once carried a press of feet now lay mostly open. The colonnades or porticos that framed the space, where they existed, sheltered fewer people in their shade. There was room now where there had once been very little room, and that spaciousness, in a place meant to be full, had a quiet eloquence of its own. We should be careful not to make this sadder than it was, nor to smooth its hardships away. Picture one such place at the end of an afternoon, as one possible scene among many, long shadows reaching across the open stones, a single vendor or two where there had once been many, a handful of people crossing on their separate errands, birds settling where the crowds used to be. From a distance the scene may appear peaceful, though for those who remembered its former crowds, it could also carry loss or unease. The space seems to wait, as such places do, for gatherings that now come less often than they once did. The noise and movement had diminished, along with some of the public functions they once carried, the trade, the news, and the business of the community conducted face to face. And yet a city could live a long time like this, in its quieter rooms and quieter squares, smaller than it was but not yet ended. The grandeur remained in the proportions and the worn stones and the lines of the place. As fewer gatherings renewed the city's shared identity in the present, stories of earlier crowds could carry more of its remembered life. What the squares no longer staged, memory began to hold. When a city has fewer crowds to gather in the present, it does not lose its past all at once. That past lives on for a while in the people who remember it, and in the stories they tell. This was one of the quieter ways a fading city held on to itself, not only through monuments or records, but also through the ordinary human habit of remembering aloud. We can imagine how this might have worked, though such private exchanges usually survive only indirectly, if at all. An older person, who had known the city in fuller days, describes them to someone young who never did. The festival when the square could barely hold the crowd, the market when you could find goods from places with names like music, the years when the lane was full of families before so many of the doors went quiet. These were not history lessons. They were just the things the old naturally tell the young, the way each generation hands down the world it remembers. We should be careful not to take such remembered fullness entirely at its word. Memory can soften, sharpen, simplify, or reshape what it carries, and the city of someone's childhood may grow fuller, simpler, or more vivid in the telling. But that does not make these stories worthless. Whatever their exact accuracy, they could carry something true. That this place had once been more than it now was, that it had a past worth recalling, that the quiet streets had not always been quiet. Picture such a scene as evening comes on, knowing it is only one plausible version of exchanges that may once have taken place. A small fire or a lamp, an older voice, unhurried, a child half listening, taking in more than they know. Through that simple exchange, a version of the crowded city could pass to someone who might carry it a little further into the future, even as the real streets outside grew stiller. Yet memory too depends on people, on there being enough of them and enough continuity between them to keep the stories moving from one generation to the next. Some memories left with the people who carried them, while others faded when the chain between teller and listener was broken. And the number of people in the city, the count of voices to remember and to listen, was the very thing that had been quietly falling all along. So let us turn, gently, to the thing that had been happening underneath everything else, the slow falling of the city's numbers. Of all the changes we have followed, this is the hardest to picture, and much of it could be difficult to recognize even while it was unfolding. There was usually no single event to mark it. A city could lose a great deal of its population without any one day ever seeming like the day it happened. Consider how undramatic the arithmetic could be and how many forms it might take. Households left and were not always replaced by new arrivals. Births might fall, or marriages come later or less often. Illness and poor health could press on families in ways no record fully captures. Infants and children did not always survive their first years. Deaths continued among old and young alike, while births, survival, and new arrivals did not always replace those who were lost or left. Each could be deeply significant to the people involved, yet no single departure, death, or missing household necessarily revealed the longer demographic pattern. It was their accumulation, leaning in the same direction over a long stretch of time, that gradually emptied the place. And we should be honest that the evidence for all this is uneven and incomplete. Scholars reconstruct ancient population trends from many kinds of traces: the inhabited area of a settlement and signs of its contraction, the houses and rooms that were occupied or left empty, archaeological surveys and the spread of material remains, written or administrative records where they survive, inscriptions, and burial or skeletal evidence. Every one of these has limits. Burial grounds, for instance, are an unreliable measure of the living, since preservation, the chances of excavation, and changing customs around death can all distort what survives. From such fragments we get general trends rather than exact numbers, and even those trends are debated. What we can say is that, in particular regions and periods, some settlements show evidence of contraction, reduced occupation, or shifting population, though others persisted, recovered, or changed in different ways. The people living through such a change were not blind to it. They might well notice an abandoned house on the lane, a market thinner than the one they remembered, a neighborhood with fewer families in it, a familiar institution grown smaller. What they could not easily see was the whole shape of it. Most individuals experienced only a portion of a change that might extend beyond a single lifetime, spread thin across many ordinary years, where some seasons were better and some worse, and the long direction was hard to feel. Its pace may appear gentle from a distance, though the individual causes within it, departure, illness, death, insecurity, and separation, could be painful for the people who lived them. A city did not have to suffer a catastrophe to grow smaller. It could simply over time lose a little more than it gained, with the occasional year of recovery or fresh arrival, until there were far fewer people than there once had been, and it might be difficult for anyone living through it to identify exactly when the transformation had occurred. But people did not only vanish. Many of them went somewhere. They might move toward villages or farms, toward agricultural estates or rural relatives, toward neighboring towns, larger cities, ports, forts, courts, or administrative centers, toward wherever work, kin, land, or security could be found. Many destinations were possible, but for some households, especially where land, relatives, employment, or protection could be found beyond the walls, the countryside offered one practical direction to follow. So let us follow that direction out through the gates and into the country and ask what it was that drew some households there. For a family weighing whether to stay or go, the land could offer certain things that a thinning city increasingly could not, and it is worth understanding the appeal plainly without either romanticizing it or dismissing it. The first and most practical draw was often food, or rather nearness to where food was grown. Many urban households depended partly on food brought in from surrounding farmland or more distant regions, though cities could also contain gardens, animals, fisheries, and local producers. On or near the land, the relationship with that food could become more direct, though in widely varying ways. Some households cultivated plots of their own. Some held land as tenants or sharecroppers. Some worked for wages or a share of provisions. Some laboured on larger estates without controlling what they produced at all. Access to land varied greatly by status, ownership, and circumstance. Living nearer food production could reduce dependence on some urban distribution networks, though rural households remained vulnerable to failed harvests, disrupted transport, market changes, and obligations to landowners or authorities. There were other pulls as well, and they varied from household to household. Some had relatives in a village or on an estate, and kin could mean shelter, work, and a place to belong. Some went where land could be worked, or where labour was wanted. Some sought a smaller settlement with closer access to land, kin, local work, or protection when the wider order grew uncertain. The motives differed: survival, obligation, kinship, employment, security, or the hope of finding a more sustainable arrangement. We should be careful, though, not to paint the countryside as a simple refuge. Rural life had hardships of its own. The labour was heavy, the exposure to weather and failed harvests was real, and a family's standing or freedom shaped its options as much in the country as in the city, and not every move was freely chosen. For some, relocation was less a free decision than the result of dependency, obligation, debt, or another person's authority, whether a landlord, an official, or a military power. For some households, the land may have offered a more workable arrangement. For others, it brought a different set of hardships and dependencies. And yet, there could be something steadying in its rhythms for those who found a place in them. Picture a modest country dwelling toward evening as one possible scene, a fire on the hearth, perhaps a small cultivated plot nearby, water drawn from a local well, spring, stream, or shared source when it could be had, and the sounds of animals settling somewhere close. It offered a different range of work, relationships, goods, risks, and routines from those of the city. For some households, especially those with access to kin, land, employment, or protection, it may have appeared more sustainable than remaining in a shrinking urban neighbourhood. Yet not everyone who might have wished to leave was able to. For all the pull of the land, departure asked things of a household that not every household could give: the means to travel, somewhere to go, people to receive them, the health to make the journey, or the freedom to choose at all. And so we should turn now to those who stayed, and to the reasons that kept them where they were. So let us turn to those who remained, not as the ones left behind in a story of escape, but simply as the people for whom staying was the shape their lives took. In many cities that lost population, some residents remained, for reasons as varied as those that led others to depart. To understand a quieting city fully, we have to sit with them a while and resist the easy assumption that departure was always the wiser or the freer choice. For some, leaving was simply not possible. A journey took resources that not every household had: the cost of travel and provisions for the road, some means of transport, somewhere to arrive, and people there to receive them. It often required family or employment connections at the other end, and sometimes legal permission or personal freedom that not everyone possessed. Age, health, disability, caregiving responsibilities, and the sheer demands of moving an entire household, its children, its dependents, its tools, animals, and possessions, could all make departure harder. For people in poor health, the risks and physical demands of travel could be considerable, and many were bound to where they were by ties they could not easily break, by debt, by labour obligations, by dependency on a particular household or landholder, by an unfree status that placed the decision in someone else's hands. For these, their options may have been so restricted that remaining was the only practical possibility available. But we should not imagine that everyone who stayed did so unwillingly. Many may have remained because this was home, and home is not a thing most people surrender easily. There were those whose work was here, whose property was here, whose family and neighbours were here, who held local status or responsibilities, who lived near familiar sacred places, and whose family graves and sacred associations lay in or around the city. There were those too for whom the conditions elsewhere were simply unknown, and a familiar life grown smaller may have seemed steadier than an uncertain one far away. Attachment to a place is its own kind of reason, and not a foolish one. We should be careful, too, not to picture those who stayed only as the poor, the old, or the powerless. The picture was likely more mixed than that. Some who remained had means and standing and kept them where they were. Some held property they were unwilling to abandon. Some had roles in what remained of the city's life that gave them reason to stay. The thinning of a city did not sort its people neatly into those who could leave and those who could not. What we can say is that those who remained continued to occupy, use, repair, and adapt parts of the city, though their circumstances and contributions varied. Picture one possible household. A door still opened in the morning, a threshold swept, a room tended, perhaps a few plants or a small cultivated patch near a wall, all carried on with a quiet steadiness amid the growing stillness around it. Such ordinary acts could preserve a measure of continuity, without making staying more virtuous than departure. And for these households, life did not stop. It went on day by day, only in a city whose population, spaces, and routines were changing around them, more open, more spacious, more silent. To stay was to live inside a place that was changing as you lived in it, and that changing daily life, carried on within the shell of a once crowded city, is where we turn next. So picture the city now from the perspective of one who stayed, and notice the strange new proportion of things. Here was a place that had once held many more people, with streets, public spaces, and buildings shaped by busier patterns of movement and use than the city now contained. And now there were far fewer people moving through it all. The physical extent of the city had not necessarily changed at the same pace as its population. That mismatch between a larger built environment and a reduced number of inhabitants could give daily life in such places a particular character. Consider what that might have meant in practice, though it varied from one city and circumstance to the next. Streets that had once carried heavier movement might now see fewer passers-by. Large buildings raised for many uses could stand partly empty, be divided into smaller spaces, or shelter fewer people than before. A household might find itself living beside houses that were less fully occupied or no longer used at all. Where parts of the city had once pressed people close together, wider margins of quiet could now surround the lives that continued. People could adapt to that new proportion by drawing daily life into a smaller and more workable compass. Rather than continue using every part of the city equally, those who remained might cluster in particular quarters, keeping closer to reliable water, work, worship, markets, protection, or neighbours. Other districts might become less frequently used. In some places, the practical centre of daily existence contracted into a more manageable area, creating smaller pockets of active settlement within the larger urban outline. There is a quietly striking image in what could happen to spaces that fell out of their earlier use. Ground once occupied by structures or paving might, here and there be put to other purposes, a small cultivated patch in a formerly built-up area, animals kept in an underused enclosure, or materials taken from an older structure for repairs elsewhere. We should not overstate this, since the evidence varies and such changes were uneven. But in some places, areas once more densely built or more intensively used could take on smaller, practical purposes. Picture one possible settlement going about its day, a cluster of occupied houses with smoke rising from a few of them, perhaps a tended plot where part of a structure had once stood, an old thoroughfare carrying little movement under the sun, and beyond the inhabited streets, other buildings or spaces lying comparatively quiet. It was neither an entirely abandoned ruin nor the busy city of earlier generations. It was something in between, a smaller population continuing inside a larger built environment. This was not, in itself, an ending. People still lived there, sometimes for generations, maintaining some buildings, neglecting others, and adapting spaces to changing needs. More of the built environment now stood beyond the daily requirements of the remaining population, and some buildings outlasted the level or type of activity they had once been created to contain. The relationship between residents and the urban fabric had begun to shift as people used, repaired, divided, neglected, dismantled, and reinterpreted spaces in new ways. And that changing relationship leads us towards what became, over time, the stones themselves. So let us turn now to the buildings themselves and to what became of them as the lives within the city thinned. We have watched the people grow fewer. In some shrinking districts, more built space remained than the current population regularly occupied or maintained. And in a place where people still lived, such buildings could be more than empty rooms. Some empty or underused buildings became resources, while others remained unused or gradually deteriorated. Consider what an unoccupied house might represent to those who stayed. It was shelter already standing and materials already gathered and shaped, work already partly completed, though reuse might still require repair, reinforcement, permission, or adaptation. In a world where building was costly and labour precious, this was not a thing to waste. But access was rarely simple. Whether a household could take over an empty building might depend on ownership, inheritance, local custom, authorities or landlords, or simply on informal occupation where no one objected. In some places, buildings appear to have acquired new, reduced or mixed uses, though their exact functions are not always easy to reconstruct from surviving evidence. A dwelling might be given over to storage, its rooms holding grain or goods rather than a family. It might shelter animals, becoming a stable or a pen where people had once slept and eaten. A space that had been domestic might take on work, housing a small craft or trade. Sometimes a household simply expanded into an empty house beside its own, moved into a sounder building, or subdivided what space it had. In many ancient settings, domestic, productive, and storage activities could already overlap, and changing circumstances might alter that balance further. And there was another, more literal kind of reuse, the borrowing not of whole buildings but of their parts. Stone, timber, tile, thresholds, and fittings were valuable, and such materials might be gathered from damaged or collapsed structures, from abandoned buildings, from monuments officially dismantled, from structures altered by their owners or by authorities, or simply from wherever access permitted. A good block of dressed stone might be lifted from an old wall and set into a new one. A beam might be salvaged, a threshold relaid, a column repurposed in a humbler context than the one it was made for. We should be careful here, since the reuse of materials happened in many periods and for many reasons, not only in decline. Material reuse could serve economy, convenience, repair, rebuilding, symbolism, or changing political and practical priorities. There is something quietly affecting in the picture of it, if we look closely, and it is worth offering only as one possible example. A finely cut stone made for some proud civic purpose, set without ceremony into the wall of a modest house or a storeroom. The bones of an ambitious city, carried piece by piece into the changing households, workshops, and activities that continued among them. Such reuse did not carry one fixed meaning. It might be practical, authorized, contested, symbolic, or simply convenient, depending on the place and circumstances. But not every empty building was reused and not every street kept its people. Where regular human use and maintenance withdrew, buildings entered another, slower process of change shaped by weather, water, plants, animals, and time. A roof left unmended let in the rain, a crack admitted a seedling, a quiet room offered shelter to nesting creatures, and the soil itself began, little by little, to gather. It is to that patient, unhurried work that we turn next. So let us follow what happens when regular maintenance declines, becomes intermittent or withdraws from parts of a building, and the natural world, never far off, begins quietly to move back in. A regularly used building is also regularly swept, cleared, patched, drained, and repaired. The small problems caught early before they have the chance to accumulate. When that attention thins, the small encroachments that were always pressing at the edges are simply free to continue. Where deterioration began varied a great deal. Roofs were one major point of vulnerability, since they were exposed and dependent on upkeep, and once a roof went unmended, rain that should have run off could instead seep in. But trouble might just as easily begin elsewhere, in foundations or drains, in walls weakened by damp, in flooding, fire, earthquake, or shifting soil, in timber that failed with age, or in the removal of materials by people. The form and pace of all this depended heavily on construction, materials, climate, drainage, and later human activity. There was no single sequence common to every building. Where water did find its way in, and soil and light gathered with it, plants could follow, though the picture differed greatly from place to place. In wetter settings, mosses, grasses, shrubs, or in time larger growth might take hold in the seams of walls and the gaps of paving, roots working slowly into joints and crevices. In drier settings, the more visible agents were often dust, wind-blown soil, salt and sparse scrub, with heavy vegetation slow to appear if it appeared at all. Some structures, well built or unfavourably placed for growth, resisted for a long while. Seeds carried on the wind or dropped by birds reached what openings they could, and grew only where moisture, soil and light allowed. Animal life did not wait on the plants. Where human disturbance decreased, birds, insects, rodents, reptiles, livestock, or other creatures might also make use of roofs, cracks, rooms, and enclosures, depending on the setting. A quieter building offered shelter, and the spaces once shaped entirely around human routines took on a different, less ordered kind of occupation. It is worth being careful here not to read this as either triumph or tragedy. The plants and animals were not reclaiming anything in any deliberate sense. They were simply occupying the space and resources available to them. And we should not assume how people nearby felt about it. They may have responded in many ways through indifference, practical concern, frustration, attachment, or loss, and their reactions are rarely recoverable with any certainty. Picture it, all the same, as it might have looked in one such place. A wall fringed with green along its top or pale with dust and salt. A courtyard where growth had pushed up between the stones, or where wind-blown soil had simply gathered. A bird slipping in and out of a gap that used to be a window. From a distance the scene may appear quiet, though the same moisture, roots, animals and openings could also weaken masonry, timber, plaster and roofs. What we are watching is not a graceful exchange between people and nature, but human maintenance falling away while ordinary environmental and biological processes carried on as they always had. And those processes brought with them something even slower and more constant than roots or rain. Alongside the plants and the creatures, fallen plaster, loosened roofing, drifting dust and wind-blown soil were beginning to settle, layer upon patient layer, across floors and courtyards and streets, starting the long work of covering what remained. So let us turn to one of the quieter processes, though not always a slow or gentle one, the accumulation of material over surfaces that were no longer regularly cleared. Of everything we have followed, this is among the most patient, but it could also arrive in sudden episodes, It might gather gradually or come more quickly through collapse, flood, dumping, or rebuilding. The material came from many directions. Some of it fell from the buildings themselves, plaster loosening from walls, fragments of roof coming down, mud bricks softening and slumping back toward the earth it was made from. Some arrived from outside, carried on the wind as dust, washed in by rain and runoff, laid down as silt by flood, blown in as soil from the surrounding land. And some was placed there by people, rubbish discarded, unused rooms filled in, floor levels deliberately raised, damaged ground leveled off, construction debris left where it fell. The mixture and the rate varied enormously with climate, construction, topography, drainage, continued occupation, and later human activity. Layer settled upon layer, each thin and unremarkable on its own, building up across years and decades. We should resist imagining a single rate that applied everywhere. In some places, material gathered quickly where wind carried abundant soil or a flood deposited silt in a single season. In others, it crept up almost imperceptibly, a structure standing largely clear for a very long time. One room might fill from within as its upper parts collapsed inward, while the street outside rose slowly from without. Some layers formed through slow settling, others recorded abrupt episodes such as flood, collapse, fire debris, or deliberate clearance. The story differed from one site to the next, and from one part of a single site to another. There is an image often reached for here, and it is worth offering only lightly, that of a place lying down to rest beneath a gathering covering, the way a sleeper settles under a blanket at the end of a long day. We should hold it loosely, since the earth has no such intention, and the process was simply matter moving as matter does. Nor was burial necessarily the end of human presence. People might go on living above, beside, or within partly filled and altered structures, so that occupation and accumulation overlapped for a long time. And here lies one of the quiet ironies of how the past survives. The same layers that covered rooms and streets could also shelter some of what lay beneath them. Under certain conditions, accumulated material protected some remains from later weathering or disturbance, even while other materials decayed within it. But preservation was never even or guaranteed. It depended on the kind of material, on moisture and oxygen, on soil chemistry and drainage and temperature, on the microorganisms present, and on whether the ground was later disturbed. Ceramics and stone often survived well, while metals could corrode and bone might endure or disappear depending on soil conditions. Wood, textiles, leather, and food remains were generally more vulnerable, though waterlogged, frozen, extremely dry, charred, or otherwise unusual environments could sometimes preserve them. So what reaches us is always partial and always selective. A great deal was destroyed, scattered, decayed, or carried off, and what remains is a fragment, shaped as much by what happened to survive as by how people once lived. But enough did remain, under those uneven layers, to tell us something of those lives. And it is the smallest of those survivals, the modest personal things that slipped beneath the dust and waited, that bring us nearest to the people who once filled these quiet streets. So let us look, at last, at the objects they left behind. So let us kneel down, in imagination, to the level of the small things, the small objects and fragments that sometimes outlasted the people who made, owned, handled, exchanged, deposited, or lived around them. After all the large movements we've traced, the water and the markets, the temples and the thinning crowds, it is these little survivals that bring us closest to ordinary lives. A wall can tell us how people built. A small worn object can make the distance between past and present feel briefly narrower, even when the hand behind it remains unknown. Consider the kinds of things that tend to come down to us, with the reminder that what survives is shaped by chance and by the conditions we spoke of, and is never the whole of what once existed. Pottery is among the most common, since fired clay endures. Cooking vessels, storage jars, cups, oil lamps, the broken sherds of pots used and discarded. Things of stone and metal can last as well, a worn grinding stone, a corroded blade, a key, a handful of coins. Now and then, where preservation conditions allowed, more fragile things survived too. A wooden comb, scrap of textile, a small clay figure, sometimes interpreted as a toy but not always securely identified. Most of what was soft and perishable is long gone. What we hold is mostly the hard, durable residue of daily life. And yet even these fragments can carry a startling intimacy if we let ourselves feel it. A used lamp may once have cast light in a room, a workshop, a sanctuary, or some other setting, though its precise history may be lost. A cooking vessel may preserve soot, repairs, residue or wear from repeated handling and heating. A worn threshold or a smoothed handle can record repeated movement and contact over time. Many such things were made for ordinary use, while others may have carried decorative, ritual, commercial, sentimental, or symbolic meanings. They were not made to be remembered, and that is part of what makes them feel so close to the texture of a real life. We should be honest, though, about how much an object can actually tell us. A thing found in the ground does not explain itself. Archaeologists read it through its context, its material, the way it was made, traces of residue or wear the other finds around it, and where exactly it lay. From these, much can be reconstructed, but a great deal cannot. A small figure might be sacred or playful or decorative. A key might once have fitted a door, a chest, a box, a gate, or a storeroom that has long since vanished, and we cannot always say whether it was lost, discarded, or simply left behind. We reconstruct carefully and incompletely, and we should hold our reconstructions lightly. Even so, there is one thing the objects tell us plainly, and it is the thing that matters most for this whole journey. They tell us that people were here, not abstractions, not populations, not the figures in a historical summary, but human beings whose belongings reach us across the centuries. They belong to human worlds of cooking, storage, work, exchange, worship, repair, play, security, and rest. Though the exact story of any one object may remain beyond recovery, the grandest history in the end rests on this. People lived here, and some trace of them remained. And so, having followed a city from its full and ordinary evenings all the way down to the small things resting beneath the dust, we are ready to step back, at last, and take in the whole long shape of what we have seen. For no single cause and no single moment explains how a city grows quiet, and it is to that larger picture that we now gently turn. So let us step back now, as far back as we can, and take in the whole of what we have walked through, the way you might pause at the top of a rise and look down over the long valley you have spent the day crossing. From here, with the small details softened by distance, one thing comes clear above all others, at least for the slow kind of quieting we have been following. There was never a single ending. There was no one cause, no one moment, no single thread that, pulled, brought everything down at once. Some cities, of course, met sharper fates through conquest, fire, earthquake, epidemic, or other sudden ruptures, but for the gradual fading we have traced, the truth is quieter and more tangled than any one event. Think back over what we have followed, remembering that no single city held all of it, and rarely in the same order. In some places, water systems became harder to maintain or to reach. Elsewhere, markets contracted, or work changed, or households departed one by one. In some, public rights grew smaller, and squares stood emptier. In others, sections of the built environment fell out of regular use, reused, then weathered, then gathered over by dust. Each represents a pattern found in parts of the ancient evidence, though they did not always appear together or carry the same importance. What such patterns suggest, taken together, is a loosening of many threads slackening at once, each making the others a little easier to slip. In one city, reduced maintenance might worsen water access. That could encourage some departures, which could then reduce labour, revenue and demand, leaving still fewer hands to keep things running. Elsewhere, the process might begin with conflict, political change, shifting trade, disease, environmental pressure, or something else entirely. The causes could feed one another quietly in a slow circling. Few people could observe the entire process across several generations, though many may have recognized parts of the change around them. It was not a row of dominoes falling in a line. It was more like water withdrawing unevenly across a broad shore, leaving some channels active while exposing other ground. And we should be honest, here at the Wide View, about the limits of what we know. The precise mix of causes differed from one city to the next, and scholars still debate their weight and order. In some interpretations, climate or water systems carry greater explanatory weight. In others, trade, political upheaval, conflict, disease, institutional change, migration, or wider regional reorganization appear more important. We have followed one plausible shape drawn from many, and the real histories were often more tangled, varied, and uncertain than any single telling can hold. But beneath all that variety lies the steady idea this whole journey has circled. Buildings, walls, and monuments give a city its physical form, but people, institutions, relationships, and repeated routines give that form its lived meaning. Many cities did not end in a single fall. They became quieter through uneven changes in population, institutions, routines, and the use of space. The sounds that faded were ordinary ones, the kind we met at the very beginning. Water carried at dawn, bread shared at a table, a door opened in the morning, a lamp lit at dusk, repeated less and less often as the people who made them moved away or passed on. Which raises a last, gentler question. When a city grows quiet, where does all that life actually go? For while some of it was genuinely lost, to death, to displacement, to the breaking of old ways, not all of it simply vanished. Some of it, as we will see, went elsewhere and carried on. So let us follow that life outward, beyond the quieting streets, and ask where it went, for the answer is more varied than the empty squares alone can show. A city growing quiet was not the same as a people vanishing. The streets fell still, but many of the human beings who had filled them carried their lives onward into other places. We should not imagine this was always gentle. Some moved by choice toward kin or land or work. Others were displaced, coerced, enslaved, separated from their families, or did not survive the upheaval at all. Movement could mean opportunity for one household and catastrophe for the next. Think about what a person carries when they move, when they are able to move at all. Not only whatever tools, vessels, clothing, or keepsakes they were able or permitted to carry, but also things less visible than possessions, though no less vulnerable to change or loss. They might carry the way they cooked, the foods they preferred, the words and turns of speech of their particular place. They might carry songs and stories, the prayers and gestures that marked their days, the skills of their hands, the memory of who their people were. Some practices and memories could travel with people, while others depended on particular places, institutions, landscapes, relationships, or communities, and could not be transferred intact. We should be careful, too, not to make this sound too neat. Things changed in the carrying. A custom kept in a new village among new neighbours slowly took on something of that new place. A recipe adapted to what the new land could grow, a way of speaking blended over generations with the ways of those around it. Some threads continued in altered or blended forms, others weakened, were abandoned, or disappeared. What moved was living, and living things change as they go when they survive the journey at all. Across different regions and periods, migration could carry practices, skills, and memories beyond the settlements where they had developed, though tracing that movement is often difficult. People who dispersed from quieting places did not necessarily disappear from human communities, even when they vanished from the written or archaeological record. A skill formed in one place might be practiced in another. A way of doing things might outlive the streets where it took shape. For some, the emptying of one settlement contributed to the growth or transformation of another. For others, movement brought insecurity and loss. There may be a measure of comfort in recognizing that some practices and memories continued elsewhere, provided we do not confuse continuity with completeness. We need not imagine that all the ordinary warmth of a quieting city, the shared meals, the festival days, the quiet competence of its households, was simply extinguished. Some of it moved, changed, blended, or continued in other settings, perhaps in other kitchens, other courtyards, other gatherings, often without anyone knowing where it had first come from. And some was permanently lost. The city grew quieter. Parts of its population, knowledge, and practices may have continued elsewhere in altered forms, while other parts ended with the people and institutions that had sustained them. And once we hold both of those truths together, the quiet places themselves begin to look different to us. Silent places can appear both as sites of loss and as points within longer histories of movement, survival, adaptation, and transformation. Which brings us, near the end of our journey, to a gentle question worth sitting with. Why do these silent places move us as they do? So let us sit for a little while with that question, here near the end of our long walk together. Why do quiet places move us? Why does a still and empty street, an abandoned room, a worn threshold with no one left to cross it, reach into us the way it does? Many people report being moved by such places, though the response is neither universal nor identical. It is worth asking gently, because the feeling, where it comes, is real, even if its sources are more personal than historical. Part of it, perhaps, is recognition. We look at the remains of an ordinary life, a hearth, a doorway, a courtyard, and we may see the shapes of our own. People here woke, worked, ate, rested, cared for others, and moved through daily routines in ways both recognizable and profoundly different from our own. They tended relatives and dependents, leaned on neighbors, met the obligations of their households and communities. The distance of centuries can narrow for a moment, and some of us feel, across all that time, a kind of kinship with strangers we will never know. A quiet place can remind us, quietly, that we belong to a very long line of people who simply lived. Part of it, too, may be the particular feeling of stillness where there was once sound. We have spent this whole journey listening for the noise of a living city, and an empty place is defined, in a sense, by the absence of exactly that. For some viewers, stillness in an old place may create a temporary sense of distance from the demands of ordinary life, a pause, a quieting of one's own thoughts. But we should not pretend the feeling is always peaceful. The same place may stir grief or unease, or the memory of violence and dispossession. It may be sacred to some, politically charged for others, and barely noticed by the rest. And part of it, surely, is what such places make us think about endings, including our own. Here too we should be careful. Some places became quieter through gradual change, while others bear the aftermath of conquest, disaster, disease, forced displacement, or sudden rupture. A quiet ruin is not proof that an ending was gentle. Yet even when individual names are lost, surviving traces can still prompt attention, curiosity, respect, or care centuries later. The people who lived here are mostly nameless to us now, and still, here we are, thinking of them. There can be a strange consolation in that for anyone who has ever feared being forgotten, though it does not make every loss easy to hold. We should be honest that the same quiet place can stir loss in one person and peace in another, or both at once in the same heart. The stones carry material histories, while the memories, cultural contexts, and emotions we bring shape how we experience them. We interpret what remains through archaeological evidence, historical context, inherited memory, and our own feelings, and for many living communities such places remain ancestral, sacred, or contested rather than merely old. But that, in the end, may be part of what these places offer. They give some of us a quiet space in which to think the large, soft thoughts we rarely make room for, about how brief and ordinary and precious a single life is, and about how people and places carry change, loss, continuity, and memory in such different ways. And it is in that gentle light that we now turn, one last time, back toward the doorway where our journey began. So let us go back, at the very last, to where we started. Back through all the centuries we have crossed, back past the buried objects and the gathering dust, past the quiet squares and the thinning streets, back to a single doorway at the close of an ordinary evening. You remember it, that imagined room we began with, the crooked wooden door, the worn threshold, the lamp inside just lit, holding back the dark of one more night and someone still at home. We began there. Let us end there too. Only now we carry everything we have gathered along the way. We now understand some of the changes that, in different combinations, could reshape cities like this one. In one place, water systems might weaken. Elsewhere, markets might thin, public rights grow smaller, populations fall, or patterns of occupation slowly shift until the dust settles at last over rooms much like this one. Holding all of that, we may feel tenderness, sadness, curiosity, unease, or some quiet mixture of them, for the ordinariness of it, for the lamp lit one more time, for the meal eaten, for the day that simply expected another to follow. Because a city leaves behind not only monuments, but also the traces of ordinary evenings and the repeated acts of daily life. The meals, the lamps, the doors opened and closed, the work taken up and set down. These were the things too ordinary to record, and yet they are much of what we have been listening for all along. And now, gently, let the lamp burn low. Picture one ordinary evening among many without asking it to stand for a single final night. The wick gutters. The small flame leans and shrinks, and the gold light on the patched plaster softens towards shadow. The flame steadies one last time, and then quietly it goes out. The room settles into darkness, while beyond it other lamps may still be burning in other streets and other homes, as they so often did unevenly, one outlasting another across the long life of a place. For tonight we can let the darkness remain simply the close of our imagined evening. It is the dark of nightfall, the dark in which living things lay down their burdens and sleep. And perhaps at the end of your own long day a little of that quiet is yours to keep as well. So let the imagined streets stay still now. Let the dust lie undisturbed. Let the doorway stand holding its small place in a story far larger than itself. There is nothing left to do tonight but rest. Thank you for walking through this quiet history with me. Wherever you are, whatever kind of day has brought you here, may it close as gently as this one does. Sleep well. The lamp is out, the imagined street is quiet, and our journey for tonight is complete.